Welcome to Reading Inspires by Reading is Fundamental. I'm your host, Dr. Erin Bailey. This podcast celebrates the power of books and the joy of reading. In each episode, we talk with educators, librarians, families, authors, and literacy champions to explore one big question. What does reading inspire for you? Through stories, research, and real-world experiences from classrooms, libraries, and homes, we explore what literacy looks like and why it matters. Whether you're nurturing young readers, shaping learning spaces, or simply love a good book, we're glad you're here. Let's get inspired. Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Jill Pentimonti, who is a member of our Early Childhood Literacy Advisory Board. A couple years ago, through the Innovative Approaches to Literacy grant, we launched Read for Success Early Childhood, which brings together read-alouds and play-based learning. And Jill, as a researcher with a research background, has supported us with our research initiative for this program. So welcome, Jill. We'll start with just introduce yourself and share your story and your journey into early childhood education and literacy.
Well, thank you. It's so great to be here talking about my absolute favorite topics. I'm thrilled to be here. So yeah, just to share a little bit about my path. I really had sort of a moment or an experience that made me just fall deeply in love with early education and early literacy. I had a windy path to that. I majored in finance as an undergrad. I love math. I love numbers. That'll come around in a minute. But I was lucky enough to spend a summer working in Chicago in an early childhood classroom, and I just fell in love with kids that age. They're so fun. They're so curious with reading to them. I just loved it. But it also made me so aware of how important early experiences are and how important early literacy experiences particularly are, and how if you have a good foundation in those, that can set you on such a fantastic path throughout your life as a student, but also as a lover of reading, right? So I think that experience really did it for me. And so I decided, hey, I want to teach. I did that for 6 years in early childhood classrooms. I loved that and had some really fantastic experiences. But really, what came back to me over and over as I was teaching is just this curiosity about how these amazing brains were working in these great kids I was working with, and how this language and literacy instruction or sort of development was happening, right? So I felt like I really needed to know those mechanisms. And it also, like I said, became clear to me more and more every day how important and how variable those early experiences were, and how little resources we have really devoted to these early experiences, and that we need to be using what works to be efficient. Our little ones deserve this, right? The best of the best. And so I think that led me to being a researcher and into this sort of early education world, where one of the things I get to do is try to understand what works best. Why is it efficient cost-wise with our limited resources? And are we doing the best for kids that we possibly can to give them that foundation of early literacy? So that's sort of the windy path I took to this role now, sort of as an early childhood education researcher. And just thrilled that I get to do things like this and have conversations about the importance of some of the things that we all can be doing as teachers, as parents, to support kids' early literacy.
Thanks, Jill. So I had no idea you had a math background. We have that in
Yeah,
common.
I
I
know.
minored in math myself,
Oh,
but
I love it.
it does make sense how, your background is
Yeah,
math, but you found this love for reading and fostering literacy with young children. But that
Mhm.
analytical part of you is what
Exactly.
drew you to the research. That's fantastic. So since you are a
Exactly.
researcher, what does research say is the secret sauce for
Yeah.
effective preschool read alouds, and why does it
Yeah.
matter?
I love this question because my absolute favorite part of the day when I was a teacher was doing that read aloud and shared book reading. It was so fun because, the kids were engaged, I was engaged. We either were laughing or we were talking about a serious topic because we could through a book, or we're just learning cool things. And so when I sort of got deeply into the research, when I was getting my PhD, I was so excited that there was this body of research that said, yeah, you're right. It isn't just the fun, or you don't just think this is a good instructional practice. This is truly changing kids' skills. And I just am so excited by the fact that this fun activity that we naturally do with kids in homes, in schools, actually has meaningful impact on kids' skills. But like you said, what's that secret sauce is the key to it. Flipping the pages, reading the words off the page is not the key. That's not the secret sauce. What the secret sauce is the human interaction, the back and forth, the language, so the question asking, the things that are being pointed out during that read aloud, right? So that is so, so key to making sure that this really cool experience, again, that we do naturally, is as effective and as efficient as possible. And so, I often try to think about this interaction piece, right, is in three big buckets. And those buckets we know are the types of skills and the types of things we're talking and instruction we're doing with kids that we know from research are most impactful to children becoming skilled readers later. One of those is language, using their language, getting their listening comprehension up and running, right? You're not doing reading comprehension when you're pre-K, but you are doing listening comprehension. And so you as a parent or teacher, when you're asking good questions, when you're saying, what do you think is going to happen next? You're getting that listening comprehension going. Another good part about asking a question like, what do you think is going to happen next? A child has to use more than one word to answer that question, right? And the way to learn language is to use language. So it's such a wonderful way to sort of build language skills. The other one is print knowledge. We know that kids knowing the names of letters and the sounds they make is one of going into kindergarten, having that knowledge is one of the best ways to prepare them for reading success. Print all over books. It's a great way to point out print, point out letters. There's your letter A, Amy. It's right there in that word, right? Saying things like that get kids paying attention to print. And then the other third piece that I think about that's so good in that interaction secret sauce part of Reload is sounds of language. Because when kids are learning to decode or sort of read the words, like knowing that CAT says at, and you blend it together for cat, right? That's a skill. You've got to listen to those sounds of language. So practicing that when you're reading rhyming books, there's so many great rhyming books out there. Books with alliteration or books that have the same sound, like Silly Sally is one, right? So you're getting kids to pay attention to the sounds of language. All of those kinds of activities, that interaction that you can be doing is absolutely the secret sauce. And again, what I love about read alouds is that just makes it easy. It is natural, right, to ask those kinds of questions because books and that activity itself just makes it easy for the adult to be doing those sorts of things with kids.
That was so helpful the way you broke that down into the three buckets of listening comprehension. And I noticed you did say
Yeah.
listening comprehension rather than reading comprehension because
Right,
they're young children. They're being read a book
exactly.
too. And
Hmm.
then the print knowledge and then the language sounds. That's
Yep.
super helpful. For the first, maybe some families who might be listening, do you have any tips? Do they need to cover all of those three buckets in one read aloud, or are
Good
they able
question.
to, pick and choose as they're going?
Hmm. It's a great question. And I say this a lot too, because I think there's a temptation to ask all the questions all at once, right? But then what we think about is the story is fantastic as well. And so we want to stay to that and keep kids engaged. So no, not all of those need to be asked at once. I often think about, and I realize this like coming from being a teacher, like I really needed to be more planful. Take a minute, and this doesn't take a lot of planning. I am not talking about 15, 20 minutes. I'm talking about take a quick look through the book and think, oh, there's a vocabulary word I might need to sort of talk about to boost up some listening comprehension. Or this book has great print. Like sometimes books have really cool looking print. Like I will definitely want to point out print in that. Sort of look at each book and think about what you might want to pull out when you're reading that book. And then the other piece I say to your point of do you want to hit all three all at once is we all know this. Kids love to reread books.
Oh, yeah.
That you don't just have one bite at the apple in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes we wish we could move on from a certain book, right? Which I love about kids too. But you're going to have a chance to read that again. And so, often if it's like sort of a really cool story, I'll think, oh, that first time around, I'm going to read this loud. I'm just going to ask questions about what the story is about. And then the second time, I'll pull out some really cool things about the print. And the third, I'll talk about sounds of language. Or if it's an alphabet book, I won't maybe do as many questions in the listening comprehension space, but I'll talk a ton about letters, right? So just being a little bit thoughtful, again, not a ton of time, but a little bit thoughtful about when you pick up a book, kind of breezing through and thinking, okay, these are some cool questions I can ask. I don't have to ask them all at once.
That's so helpful. And I was going to say that, especially for families, if you own the
Mhm.
books, you're going to read them many, many times.
Right.
One thing that
Right.
I experienced the other day, actually, though, because, I read aloud with my daughter, she's 5, was that I like to ask children to make predictions. That was always one of my favorite things to
Hmm.
ask when I was a teacher, too, especially when I
Right.
taught first grade. But actually, what I discovered the other night was if you know the ending to the book, sometimes you
Yeah.
can't always ask that.
That's
So I
right.
think one tip that I learned myself, over the course of the last week
Hmm.
or so is if you are going to ask to make predictions, it's probably best on the first time that you're reading the book.
Exactly. Exactly. And some of the tips too that I'd give teachers and parents is just that. Like think about how often you want to ask the same type of question. I noticed too that teachers and parents often read the title and the author and focus on that a little bit.
Mm,
Once you do it once, you don't really have to do it every time, right? So think about mixing up those questions as you're doing each read aloud, right? So I think it's fine to not ask the exact same questions over and over, but think about sort of varying the types of things you're talking about with the child.
yeah, that's wonderful. So you mentioned
Hmm.
rhyming books earlier, and we're focusing on very young children, 3, 4,
Hmm.
5 years, 6 years
Hmm.
old, pre-readers really. Um,
Yeah.
and what should teachers look for, or families look for when they're
Yeah.
choosing books, especially for children to be able to see themselves, learn about the world around
Hmm.
them, and engage in the
Hmm.
kind of rich language that you shared?
Yeah, I love this too because it's one of my favorite things to talk about because I've done some research in this space. And what I say is a balanced diet. Think about it as we think about sort of what our meals should look like, right? We need a variety of protein and veggies and carbohydrates, right? Think about it in that same sense. Narrative books are fantastic. There's so much good about narrative books. You can talk about story structure, which is sometimes sort of abstract. When you say the words beginning, middle, and end, to a 3, 4, 5 year old, that's a very abstract concept. That's really hard to describe.
Yeah.
But when you're reading a book, it's super easy then to say, oh, at the beginning, this happened in the story, right? That's such a great way to get story structure, vocabulary words. I love reading books about emotions with the kids in my
Hmm.
classroom. Giving kids the ability to have a new word for the emotion they're feeling just opens up communication lines. And books about emotions make it so helpful to talk about it, right? So those sorts of things. And like you said, the prediction and the language listening comprehension piece. Narratives are spectacular. What we know, and this is sort of what I was referencing in my research, so when I first came to grad school, one of the things I did was try to understand what are kids getting exposed to? And we know about 95% of the time, children are getting exposed to narrative books.
Hmm.
What that means is they're not getting a lot of what I call information or narrative books. And those are books about a specific topic. Dinosaurs, ladybugs, rocks, right? We're not seeing a lot of those. And there's actually a lot of really cool books out there that are purely often pictures and have labels and have bolded words and are new vocabulary and really are about a topic. And what I love about those books is a couple of things. One, they look a whole lot look like a textbook. And when kids get into third grade and they're moving from this learning to read to reading to learn, they're going to have a lot of textbooks. So if they're really comfortable with that structure, that there's bolded words, that there's maybe a pop out picture that had labeled parts of a plant or something like that, if they know sometimes there's a text box that has a new kind of fact over here, if that doesn't confuse them, if they're used to that text structure, their comprehension is going to be that much better. So getting kids exposed to that young is super important. There's going to be technical vocabulary. Kids really love that technical vocabulary. I think they have fun learning new words like that. And the information books are such a fun way to learn those new words. And it can be so motivating because of their topics they really want to learn about. So the point being, hey, let's have this balanced diet of both narrative books and information books. And then I also think of other types of books, sort of more in that narrative point too, that are alphabet books. So you are
Mm.
talking about letters and their sounds, rhyming books, so you're listening to those sounds of language, and then books that really help kids understand different cultures, maybe that they haven't been exposed to, or different roles in this world that maybe they haven't been exposed to. Or, like I said, emotions, being able to talk about their emotions. Books are such a special way to have some of those conversations and learn some of those topics. So, really, that the whole point being like, let's make sure we're getting a balanced diet when we're thinking about the types of books we're choosing.
When you were talking, it was making me think of one of the favorite books that I discovered when my daughter was just a baby and we were reading, board books. There were all kinds of books that were ABC books, but about
Mhm.
people, like ABC biographies, where
Yeah.
each page would be
Yeah.
Amelia Earhart and the name of someone.
Hmm.
And I enjoyed reading those with her so much because
Yeah.
she was very young. So at that point, reading was more of a bonding experience. But
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
me, I was learning so much about these
I
amazing
love
people
it.
too, some of which I
Hmm.
never heard of before, and then would go off and do my own research about these people. And then I started
Yeah.
thinking about authors' intent, how
Mhm.
were these 26 women chosen for this ABC of women's history
Right.
book. So there was a lot of although this is a children's book, there was a lot of deep
Hmm.
thinking that was going on for me as well.
I love it. I love it. There are just so many fantastic books out there. That's part of the fun of this topic as well, is I just think we are so lucky to have this volume of types of books that are just so fun to expose kids to. So,
Yeah, and they keep being more, so we can go
yeah.
back and read, some classics from our
Yep.
childhood, maybe Good Night Moon or,
Hmm.
I Love You Forever. That's my boss, Alicia Levy's favorite book.
Good book.
We,
Yeah.
we can go back and
Hmm.
read those, and then there are so many coming out
Yeah.
all the time, so it's
That's right.
wonderful.
It is
Um,
great.
so I want to ask you about scaffolding. What are a few
Mhm.
high impact scaffolds that teachers can use while they're doing
Yeah.
read alouds, and what might that
Yeah.
sound like?
This is one of those where I think to myself all the time, wow, I wish I'd known this when I was a teacher because I really dug into this in my when I was getting my PhD. Because I think what this is helpful is it's in the moment. When you're a teacher, you've got to make so many in the moment decisions.
Hmm.
And so what I love about thinking about these scaffolding, and as a parent too, what I love about these scaffolding ideas is that I feel like they're just like something you have in your back pocket and you can pull out when you're like, wait a minute, okay, I didn't explain that correctly, or they're not quite getting it, right? So I like to think of scaffolding in sort of two buckets. One, scaffolding when you know that child needs some extra support in whatever we're talking about, whatever question is being asked. And then two, scaffolding for when they really get it and you're ready to challenge them, right? So talking about that first bucket first, like so you need some extra support. So say you've asked a question like what do you think is going to happen next, or why did something happen in a story? And it's clear it's confusing, right? It's hard. There's ways that we can ask another question. So not you don't have to just sort of move on, but there's ways to ask another question to support learning, to make that kid one feel confident, like, oh, now we do get it, and two, do some learning. So I like to think of three different ways to do that. One is to reduce choices, right? So say, do you think he's going to go to the store or do you think he's going to go to school, right? And so then instead of having to think of this world of choices, the child then has two to pick from, right? Makes it so much easier. The other one that I like to think about is modeling, right? Sometimes, especially if it's really challenging, modeling, oh, you're right. That one's a kind of a tough question, but I know in that part of the story, he was getting his school bag ready. So I think he's going to school. Let's think about that. Where do you think he's going to go? And ask that question again. Give the child the option. You've modeled the answer. They're going to say it with you, right? Or there's kind of a co-participation when you can have that conversation and then you even say, let's say it together. With little kids, even just practicing using their language is a great way to do things. So you can see how those are really supportive. A question's been tough, but I've got these little moves I can make to support some learning. And then you've got when you're realizing, okay, this kid's really getting it. I'm ready to challenge, right? And that's where questions like predicting are fantastic because you're getting a child to think, really, you got to make all sorts of connections about what's happening in the story before and use, like I said, more than one word, a lot of language to answer that question. That is a great challenge to get sort of all the neurons firing and really sort of thinking through a good answer to that. And then another thing too, I like to ask is Why do we think something happened? Again, you've got to pull together lots of pieces of information and give your own thought and use a lot of language to explain that. You can see how these are more challenging, but getting kids to practice language and use their listening comprehension skills. And another one that's really nice and is especially good when you're, as a parent and child reading because you know so much about each other and you've got some individualized attention happening. Getting them to generalize to something that's happened in their life is going to happen, hasn't happened, but will. Sort of saying, oh, we're going to go to the zoo tomorrow. We're probably going to see, what do you think we're going to see, right? Making that connection to their own lives really solidifies knowledge and solidifies the things that you're talking about, and can get them thinking, oh, this doesn't just happen in this story that we're reading here in my living room, right? It actually happens in our everyday world, and this is sort of world knowledge. All of that is really good for kids too. So again, thinking about scaffolding both in how can I support when a concept isn't quite getting there, and how can I support to challenge as well.
Thank you for that. I think what I got out of that was also permission to ask questions with limited choices,
That's right.
because I think a lot of times, and I worked in a lot of schools that were very inquiry based. My background is in international baccalaureate too, and we're always
Hmm.
pushing teachers to ask big thinker questions, ask open-ended questions, and
Right.
I think we should be moving towards that. But
Right.
those scaffolds for, especially for our very young children and for
Hmm.
our English learners, multilingual
Yep.
learners,
That's
if
right.
if they don't yet have the language, it is helpful to give them
Hmm.
two choices. It can actually build their language, or to offer a yes or no question,
Yep.
something that they can point to or give a physical response to.
That's absolutely right. And it's so funny. That's right in line to what I found out. This is one thing I studied for my dissertation is like, how are teachers using scaffolding? Because again, it's hard to do in the moment. But that same reaction, and I saw a lot of that, is that we are asking less of those more supportive questions. And think about the confidence gives a child to answer those questions. So, of course, those open-ended questions, we're using language, we absolutely want to ask those. But in the situations in which it's necessary, those really high support scaffolding questions are so, so important. You're giving kids confidence. I've worked with a lot of speech language pathologists in my life, and they always say it's great to model. Saying things with kids, modeling that good language is one of our best techniques to build kids' language skills. So don't feel weird about saying it with kids, saying it to kids, being really sort of overt about what the answer is because you're giving that child an excellent model of your language. And that's how kids learn language, right? So.
Thank you. So we
Mhm.
talked a lot about, this instructional strategies and the scaffolds. I have heard some critiques before of you shouldn't, stop and ask questions or do so many things when you're reading aloud to kids. It takes away
Mhm.
the joy or the experience. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about how educators, families can keep that balance of reading aloud
Mhm.
joyfully and artfully with
Yeah.
intentional vocabulary building, comprehension, print awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is sort of the work that I'm doing now is building some curriculum and some supplements for teachers to do just that, right? You're getting lessons that help you do just that. A lot of what I say to teachers too, and I think this is a good one for parents too, is flip through that book really quickly before you're going to read and put sticky notes, right? Like children aren't even going to notice you put a sticky
Yeah.
note there. It's fine. You put a sticky note on like, oh, this is a vocabulary word. This is the perfect time to do some vocabulary instruction with this word in this book, and we'll talk about it for a minute. And then 2 pages later, there's some really cool print on this page, and it's got my child's letter J right there in huge, cool letters, right? We're pointing that out. We're talking about it, right? Or this is the first time we're reading it. I'm definitely going to ask, what do you think is going to happen, right? So doing those sorts of things and making sure you know your child or you know your class, right? How many questions really helps and flows. So I think making sure you are planful and then making sure you're doing squat kind of the right amount that it's not over and but you're still getting the story. And then when I talked about rereading before, I think what's great about rereading is by the time kids have read a story once or twice, they're getting it. They're not as much on the edge of their seats, right? So
Hmm.
you can ask a few more questions. So I always think of that first read aloud, especially if it's a really sort of in-depth story. I don't ask too many questions, just make sure everybody's getting it and like maybe some prediction. But then the times after is when you can really load up some of the questions because they're just reading it because they like that story, but they know what's happening and you're ready to ask a few more questions, right? The other piece, as I already talked about information books, a lot of what I love to say to teachers and parents is give them permission. you do not need to read the whole book. There is no rule that says you have to sit down with an information book that doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end
Mm.
and read the entire thing. You really don't. A lot of them are big. So I'd like to do cool things, and kids love this. Teach them about what a table of contents is. Go to the table of contents and say, which couple pages should we read today? And you get to pick from the table of contents, and you get to show them that information books don't always have to start and end, right? You can move to page 12 and read the cool thing about the pterodactyl and not start at the beginning. Giving yourself that permission, especially with information books, to read small snippets at a time, I think is super useful.
And I think too, with very, very young children, 1, 2, 3-year-olds, it's absolutely okay not to read it beginning to end or read
100%.
every words on the page because really they're exploring at that point, and
Hmm.
it's about setting up good reading
Absolutely.
behaviors and setting up
Totally.
good routines for yourself to cultivate that
Hmm.
joy of reading.
Exactly. It's the joint attention, it's the interaction back and forth, and it's the showing kids literally how a book works. You need to learn that a book opens like this, right? And that print moves from one direction to another. Those sorts of things are all the really cool things you can be doing when you're reading it with that age group. It doesn't have to be every single word. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
So you did mention before, I wish I knew this when I was a teacher, and I
Yeah.
say the same thing to myself all the time. What do you think are the most common read aloud misses that you either experienced yourself or you
Yeah.
observed, even from well-intentioned teachers and family?
For sure. Some of it too is I felt like I needed to ask the same questions or do the same routines with every book. Like I said, like the title and author. You
Hmm.
don't need to ask the same exact types of questions every time. That's why I really like this idea of being a little bit planful about, okay, with this read aloud, I'm really going to focus on these types of questions or those types of questions. So I think that's like a sort of a common mistake too. And then, I've said print knowledge before, but I find, in part of the work that I've done, I've seen lots of read alouds, and so we see what teachers point out or not. It's really not that much print. All teachers aren't pointing out print all
Hmm.
that often. And I think about back to myself, I was really focusing on the questions about what the story was about and a little bit less on these concepts of print. Like I said, how print works on a page, how it's different than a picture, what direction it's moving, the names of letters, the sounds of letters. But giving kids that concept of like, we couldn't be reading this page as, these words off the page if we didn't understand that all of these little symbols have a sound and a name and that pulling together is a word. Like this is the perfect time to get kids talking about print and pointing out print. And I think that's one of the more common mistakes. You talk a lot about the story and a little bit less about the print and the components of it, which is really key to reading success as well.
I had kind of a similar experience reading aloud to my daughter, which I shared before. She's 5. There's a book called Big, and
Mhm.
there are several pages in the middle of the book that are wordless
Mhm.
pictures, which was a great opportunity to teach about print because we got to those pages and my daughter said, "Why aren't you reading anything?"
Yeah,
And I said, "Well,
that's
look,
perfect.
there's no words on this page. So the author and
Mhm.
illustrator just want us to look at this page." And,
Yeah,
then we talked about the
perfect.
illustrations and the characters'
Mhm.
feelings on those page. So I think there are lots of
Mhm.
opportunities to infuse print knowledge into our read
Exactly.
alouds.
Exactly. Like, there's a meaning, there's a reason we need to write down these little symbols. Getting that concept is so cool and so beautiful and the perfect way to do it during a read aloud, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
So for families listening, what are 2 or 3 simple tips that they could start integrating before, during, after reading tomorrow into their story time routine?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is what's fun about, knowing your child really well. Like the first step is choosing that book. What's cool is like, like for example, an information book. Is dinosaurs it? Is butterflies it? Is rocks it? Right? So like you have that knowledge of like, oh, I'm gonna get an information book on this topic. I know this is really gonna hit the spot, right? That those books that will engage them. And you know which books they want to reread. Like I said, there's not a problem with rereading. It's actually a
Hmm.
benefit. It's a great thing. Like you can infuse so much knowledge with your child when you're rereading. Because again, sometimes you're asking language questions, sometimes you're asking some vocabulary within that language, sometimes you're pointing out print. You can do so much when you reread a book, right? And then I think what's also fun about sort of the family piece of this is you can tie in things you've been talking about when you read your book into your day or the next morning, right? Let's say you were talking about the sound of the letter S when you're reading Silly Sally. The next day, or later in that day, start pointing out other words that you're encountering in the grocery store, for example, that start with an S, right? You can then anything you're doing in that read aloud, you can then bring up again and again and again, right? So I think that's really helpful too. And then, like what I was saying with the scaffolding, one of the really good ways to get kids to really build background knowledge, to truly understand what they're learning, to use that good language, to keep those new vocabulary words they know really in their head, is to tie them to their own life. All of us are the same. When we have knowledge that makes sense to us, that ties to the background knowledge we already have, it's really going to sit in your head. It's going to be solidified. And so you know your child really well. You can start having those conversations that say things like, oh, that animal giraffe, remember when we saw that giraffe
Hmm.
XYZ time, right? That's really going to help make things concrete for kids. So there's some really great things, I think, that sort of more individual conversations when you can bring out when it's, a caregiver and a child too that are really special.
Yeah. So we always end this podcast by asking, what does reading inspire for you?
So many things. I just, in general, like I said before, I just love that reading is this gift we can give people for the rest of their lives to open new knowledge for the rest of their lives. And as an avid reader, joy, it can bring you so much joy, right? So I just am so inspired by that. So that's just always a thought process. But honestly, one of the things that I have been fascinated by and what I'm really inspired by reading lately, the more I sort of dig into this research world, is how our brains work, how kids' brains work. To be readers is just so inspiring to me. We learn language by being immersed in language-rich environments, right? When we're sort of, are surrounded by it, we learn these language skills. We build that one specific part of our brain that we know is sort of language-based. But for reading, we need direct and explicit instruction to learn. We need to build pathways between different parts of our brain to become readers. The part that's language, the part that knows letters, the part that builds these sounds together. And so, what I think is so inspiring when we are both reading and we're instructing in reading and we're building kids' brains is that by having these conversations, by doing these read louds, by talking about early literacy with kids, we're literally building their brains. We're literally building neural pathways between the parts of the brain that we need to work together to learn to read. And to me, that's a miracle. It's fantastic that the things that we can be doing as adults with kids can then build their brains to give them this gift of reading. So lately, that's been inspiring me to think about us as builders of really strong brains, to give this gift of reading.
I love that, Jill. Reading is the gift that keeps giving. And I think I
Yes.
see your mathematics background coming back in
Right.
there too,
That's
about
right.
how we can build their brains through reading and
Hmm.
have that be a gift for them. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. And thank you for listening to Reading Inspires by Reading is Fundamental. I hope today's conversation sparked new ideas, meaningful connections, and a renewed love of reading. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with a fellow literacy champion, and join us next time as we continue exploring what reading inspires.